Welcome to Unit 5, The American Revolution, Lesson 8, The War Ends. How often does winning against impossible odds happen in real life? When that first shot was fired in Lexington, no one could have predicted that 13 small colonies would defeat one of the greatest armies. A pivotal year. British hopes for victory in the South began to fade after their defeat at Kings Mountain. In 1781, American General Nathanael Greene moved south to regain South Carolina and Georgia, where the British still had 8,000 men spread thinly throughout the large region. Greene's 1,500 Continental soldiers and the guerrilla units helping them were able to defeat small groups one by one. Americans were able to take back most of the area. Meanwhile, in Virginia, Lord Cornwallis replaced Benedict Arnold as commander of the British forces in the area. In Yorktown, with an army of almost 8,000 men, Cornwallis camped on a peninsula facing the York River. His aim was to protect the harbor for the use of British fleet. Cornwallis requested more troops from New York, but the British were slow in sending them. Setting up camp on the peninsula would prove to be a fatal mistake for Lord Cornwallis and his soldiers. The world turned upside down. American and French troops surrounded Cornwallis's camp by land and sea. French naval officer Admiral Comte de Grasse commanded a French fleet on the York River. He approached the British camp from the water. Meanwhile, a combined army of French soldiers commanded by Comte de Rochambeau and Americans led by General George Washington marched south from New York, approaching the camp by land. In a show of military expertise, or skill, these three commanders led their 17,000 troops against Cornwallis, trapping him on the peninsula. Cornwallis had no choice but to surrender. The Battle of Yorktown. Charles O'Hara, second in command to Cornwallis, tried to surrender his general's sword to Rochambeau, but the French leader steered him to Washington instead. The British military band played a song called "The World Turned Upside Down," a fitting comment on the victory. The Battle of Yorktown was the last major battle of the war. In 1782, more than 6 years after the first shots were fired, the British Parliament officially voted to end the war. The impact of this victory is staggering. Once only the dream of a group of visionaries seeking freedom from unreasonable laws and taxes, the young country had come through the fire of war to take its place as a full-fledged nation. In the decades and centuries that followed, the United States of America, established with the promise of equality for all, would rise to become one of the most powerful and influential nations on earth. In time, people in many countries around the world would draw inspiration from America's example and fight for their own freedom and independence.
Despite some recent victories, Americans were growing frustrated with the slow progress towards independence, with the war entering its 5th year. You're not kidding, are you? It certainly didn't help that Benedict Arnold switched sides on us, joined the British Army, and began conducting horrific raids on the colonists in Virginia. Hi guys, Alexander Hamilton. You ask why I'm here. Well, other than being infamous for the Aaron Burr duel, the $10 bill, and my musical, which I hope you've seen, I was instrumental in the victory at Yorktown. There were a number of other reasons why morale was low. First of all, France would soon cut off financial and military aid to the Patriots as their efforts had not yielded any real results. Big Southern losses at Savannah, Charleston, Camden, and most recently Guilford Courthouse. Growing concerns of mutiny within the officer ranks of the Continental Army. Soldiers weren't getting paid because of high inflation and shortage of money. Yes, it was at this time that I penned a letter to a friend in April 1781. We're at the end of our tether, and that now or never our deliverance must come. Cornwallis here. Well, things weren't much better for us. Our winning streak sort of stalled in the Carolinas, so I figured that Virginia was the next best stop in the Redcoats Southern Tour. Great, Charles. I'm in New York barely hanging on to what we have here, and you want to diddle around in Virginia. Would be nice if you stopped disregarding my orders and properly finished the job in the Carolinas. You risk losing our gains there. Not smart, and I'm not happy. In May 1781, Washington and Comte de Rochambeau met again in Wethersfield, Connecticut to discuss a possible attack on New York City, the heart of British control in the north. I gotta tip my hat to Rochambeau. I was thinking it was best for us to launch a joint attack on Henry Clinton in the New York area. What Washington didn't know was that Rochambeau had already ordered de Grasse and his navy to start heading to Virginia before Washington had signed off on the plan. So I had to figure out how to get my troops out of the New York area without being detected by Clinton. So we started to send out fake battle plans, which were intentionally lost and surprisingly discovered by the Redcoats. We even had fake French bakeries in the camps to trick Clinton that we were planning a joint attack. In July, Washington and his troops successfully left the New York area undetected and met up with Rochambeau's troops at Dobbs Ferry, New York, to jointly march south. I arrived at Petersburg, Virginia on May 20th, and I was getting a bunch of confusing messages from Henry Clinton. There was no confusion on my end, crystal clear to me. Anyways, I dispatched at the end of August Admiral Tom Graves, his fleet, and troops from New York to Virginia to help out Cornwallis. I picked Yorktown because it was easy to defend, plenty of water access for our esteemed British Navy. However, my plan depended on us having full control of the waters. Unfortunately, I didn't know that the French fleet under de Grasse was on his way and nearly at the Chesapeake Bay. Admiral de Grasse arrived at the Chesapeake Bay at the end of August with over 30 ships and over 3,000 new troops to join Marquis de Lafayette, who was already in Virginia. This is a big deal because the French took control of the Chesapeake Bay. Graves and his British naval fleet didn't arrive until September. As Graves and the British Navy approached on September 15th, de Grasse's navy was blocking the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay. Both sides prepared for an epic battle. The two giant naval competitors began firing at close range around 4 p.m., and by dusk, de Grasse prevailed. I told you, Cornwallis, but you didn't listen to me. I arrived back in May to the Yorktown area and had about 5,500 troops and would over the coming weeks top up to about 7,000 troops. We finally arrived together with Rochambeau's troops in late September and joined up with Lafayette's troops. We put up a camp about 13 miles from Cornwallis and were ready to lay siege to Yorktown. Oh dear, I knew that we had a big problem on our hands as we were greatly outnumbered, and we were now cut off by the French fleet. We had big problems ahead. I erected a number of redoubts to make it harder for those pesky patriots to reach us, but the American and French troops began to creep closer and closer by digging parallel trenches. By October 3rd, the Allies surrounded Yorktown and were ready to launch the siege. Starting on October 6th, a number of trenches were built to get in range of the British forces. Just a little bit later, Washington began an artillery bombardment on the afternoon of October 9th that lasted for nearly a week to prevent Cornwallis from repairing his defenses. That's right, we bombarded the Redcoat positions day and night so Cornwallis didn't have a chance to rebuild his defenses. After 5 days and nights of heavy artillery bombardment, Washington ordered new trenches dug that would require the taking of British redoubts number 9 and number 10. On the evening of October 14th, the American and French allies began their assaults. Washington gave me the responsibility to capture redoubt number 10. I had prepared intensely for this mission, and I'd be darned if I weren't going to succeed. It was pretty nasty hand-to-hand fighting as the Americans came at us with fixed bayonets. We surrounded number 10 redoubt and charged it with all of our might. We finally overwhelmed the Redcoats and took control. What a success! Not only was this a great victory, but we had only sustained about 35 casualties. The French had a tougher time with redoubt number 9, but they were victorious in the end. I tried to counterattack on October 15th, but I was surrounded on all three sides by enemy artillery, and it was an abysmal failure. Cornwallis's untenable position led him to negotiate surrender terms. He requested honorable surrender terms, but Washington refused. On October 19th, Cornwallis surrendered. We suffered only around 400 casualties, while the British had around 1,000 men killed or wounded. With the surrender of Cornwallis's army, the British force had lost about a third of its army. The Battle of Yorktown was the last major battle of the American Revolution because Parliament passed a resolution soon thereafter calling for an end to the war. While the British still had around 30,000 men in America, they just weren't as keen to fight after the huge loss at Yorktown. On September 3, 1783, the Revolutionary War officially came to an end when the Treaty of Paris was signed.
Just a quick review before we end this video. Guerrilla warfare is a form of irregular warfare where they did not stand in line to shoot in battle. So this was a very different type of warfare, one that the British were not used to. American and French troops surround Cornwallis's camp by land and sea at Yorktown. The British ended up surrendering, and the war ends. Cornwallis was the British commander during the Battle of Yorktown. Washington, Rochambeau, and Greene commanded the French and American military at Yorktown. The Battle of Yorktown started on September 28, 1781, and lasted till October 19, 1781. This was the last major battle of the war, and in 1782, more than 6 years after the shots were fired, the British Parliament officially voted to end the war. That's all for today's video.